Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. And let's talk about water. Water is something that we urgently need. It is something that takes up nearly 80% of our planet. It is one of the most important resources that life on this planet actually has. And there are certain conditions that are good for human life, and there are some conditions that cause disease and bring human society more or less to a halt. So there's a WHO report on global analysis and assessment and sanitation of drinking water. And the report shows the acceleration is a need in many countries to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goal for water. And that goal, they're looking to meet that goal by 2030. 45% of the countries are on track to achieve a nationally defined drinking water coverage targets. Only 25% of the countries are on track to their national sanitation targets. Less than a third of the countries reported have sufficient human resources required to carry out key drinking water sanitations. So, let's look at some of the war-torn countries, and look at some countries that have been devastated by different types of natural disasters, such as Haiti, Syria, and where the drinking water, because of levels of bacteria and things that are actually in them, and maybe other contaminants, isn't exactly safe to drink. Clean drinking water has been a problem for human society for a very long time, and this is the United Nations and the WHO's push to actually bring drinking water to every person on the planet. And why not? Why can't we bring clean drinking water to everybody? It helps child development. It helps a lot of different diseases just simply disappear when our drinking water has been cleaned and certain levels of bacteria removed from it. So, why don't we listen to the actual report from the WHO and the UN experts in this next particular segment.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this global virtual press conference coming to you from the World Health Organization studio in our headquarters here in Geneva. I'm Margaret Harris, and I'll be moderating this press conference on the UN Water Global Analysis and Assessment of Sanitation and Drinking Water, Sanitation and Systems, but we call it the GLASS report for short and for ease. This is an embargo press conference, as I hope you all know, and the embargo lifts at 0900 Geneva time tomorrow. That is CET, Central European time, tomorrow, Wednesday, 14 December. You should have also received an embargoed press release, I hope, on this. And of course, the embargo lift on the press release lifts at the same time. Repeat it again, 0900 Geneva time tomorrow morning. Many of you, I know, have requested embargoed copies of the full report, and of course, it's the same embargo. So enough of embargoes, and on to the subject that brings us here today. We've got two expert speakers, Bruce Gordon, who's the unit head of our Water, Sanitation, Hygiene and Health team, and Fiona Gore, who's the technical officer in the Water, Sanitation, Hygiene and Health team. Now, Bruce will give us an overview of the findings and a short discussion of the critical points in the report, and Fiona's here to help with any questions that you may have. So, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Bruce, who will give us that promised overview. Over to you, Bruce.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Margaret, and thank all of you for joining the conference. So the report that Margaret just mentioned is quite a comprehensive report. It's the most comprehensive report and covers 121 countries that we've ever done. And essentially, what we're doing is we're tracking the efforts of countries to improve water, sanitation, and hygiene. And those efforts could be anything from financing, policy work, commitments, human resources, training, and we compile them all into one aggregate report. And so there's lots of findings in them. One of the first findings that we wanted to call to your attention, and it kind of reconfirms this whole notion that we need dramatic acceleration. We know there's already billions of people without access to drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. So what we did in this report was we had a close look at the national targets that governments around the world have set. That was one thing that we did. And these are targets that they maybe, we would like to see 100% access to water, sanitation, and hygiene by the year 2030, aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals, or they may be as low as, for example, we would like to see coverage of sanitation to get to 60% by 2025. But these are nationally owned, and the concerning news for us is that only 25% of countries are on track to meet their target for sanitation. And this is their own target, 45% only for drinking water. And this is against a backdrop of a tremendous amount of disease, from diarrhea linked to ingestion of poor water with the root cause of poor sanitation, lack of hand hygiene that impacts also on respiratory infections. And so almost 2 million people are dying every year because of poorly managed water, sanitation, and hygiene. So when we look at this situation, the first kind of, I guess, plea from WHO is that countries need to recommit to the targets they've already made in order to save these lives. There is a major opportunity with a future first in 50-year conference that will happen in March, where countries around the world will have the opportunity to make sort of voluntary commitments to improve the water situation. We've also seen some other kind of, I guess I would say, nuggets in the report. We know that climate resilience and adaptation to climate change are huge issues that are impacting, all of us. And yet when we look at the policy response, whether it's climate resilient technologies, which are simple things to avoid floods or to mitigate droughts, simple risk management or simple technologies, these are not being put in place. So what really does need to be done here? One part of our analysis has shown that there are some characteristics of high-performing countries. It may not necessarily mean causality, but it is kind of what successful countries have done, and they have, first of all, used money wisely and effectively. So they've essentially spent the domestic capital commitments that were allocated, for example, by the Ministry of Finance. We know many countries, while they need more money, and I think 75% of countries feel like they have inadequate financial resources, many of those countries are not spending. So the first thing is to put systems in place and have the resources in place to actually make that expenditure. And when it comes to financial issues, there does need to be cost recovery, and cost recovery typically should be coming from tariffs and user fees, so that water or wastewater or sanitation service providers can keep operating over the long term. All or most of the high-performing countries have put in place regulatory functions. So these are, for example, having a drinking water quality regulator that would be able to collect data and publish reports and make that transparent and available for, monitoring and accountability reasons. And of course, these countries generally also have good human and financial resources in place with good training programs. So maybe I'll just conclude, Margaret, just with a couple of pieces of good news. Because we did find in the report there were some modest increases in budgets, in spending by governments to a tune of, I think, about 5%, where we were able to get trend data. So despite some of the impacts of COVID and the dire, the troubling or challenging financial situation we are in the world, there has been spending increases, and government public expenditure has increased, and so that's really what we want to see. So there's lots of opportunities, we feel, to really reduce this disease burden that is frankly neglected, because diarrheal disease is just, seems to be one of those diseases that is forgotten about until we have a cholera crisis, for example, but until some of these emergencies come about. So that's what we want to shine the spotlight on.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for that. A really good overview. We've got quite a lot of people online. I'd like to remind everybody that unfortunately we only have this press conference in English. We don't have the luxury of translation services for this particular press conference, and apologies for that. And also, could you please, when I call on you, give your name and your outlet so that we all know what it is. Now, we have a question from Abdullah, but he wishes to ask it in Arabic. We've asked that you ask it in French if you can, Abdullah, because we have some French speakers in the room, but we unfortunately don't have Arabic speakers. So Abdullah, if it's all right for you to ask that in English or French, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oui, merci. Bonsoir. Merci d'avance. Ma question est sur le sujet du dessalement de l'eau de la mer. Y a-t-il une réponse sur les produits chimiques utilisés dans le dessalement de l'eau de mer? Et est-ce qu'elle avait un danger sur la santé de l'homme? Et merci beaucoup.
So, sorry, just because my French sometimes needs improvement, but the question was on the safety of desalination of seawater. Was that correct, Fiona, or was there a...
No, I think it was difficult to understand.
Okay. So thank you for your question, and it's a good question. We see, a tremendous amount of, pressure on available freshwater resources. So while desalination is energy intensive, it may be, an only solution for some countries. So we do have advice at WHO to manage desalination safely. One of the important things in our advice is to make sure that there's remineralization of the drinking water, so that there is, a kind of a sufficient amount of calcium and magnesium for health, but also to make sure that the water entering into the distribution system is not so aggressive that it corrodes things. So I think the short answer is desalination, when managed properly, is safe and effective.
Thank you very much. And I hope that answers your question, Abdullah. Now, I think we're getting a lot of sort of questions in the chat, but we need you to raise your hand so that we can see who's in the queue. So please, could you all raise your hands for your questions? Meanwhile, I'll go to a question that was submitted earlier online, and this one's about COVID. How has COVID affected what you're seeing in the numbers, and has it affected the progress towards improving water and sanitation?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think one of the findings you'll read in the report is about external support, because many of these governments that are public budgets in countries that are developing are quite modest. So the proportion of kind of aid can make a real difference, and that aid has gone down. And we, believe or speculate that, understandably, that foreign aid has or external support aid has gone to health. So I think WASH was water, sanitation, and hygiene did what were impacted by that. But I think conversely, I think the COVID-19 pandemic did sort of expose some of these weaknesses that we're seeing, with this report and previous reports. This lack, 2.3 billion people lacking the facilities to wash their hands. And I do very much remember our Assistant Director General at the time saying we're pleading with people to wash their hands to prevent COVID, yet there's 2.3 billion people lacking the means to do so, whether it's because they don't have soap or because they don't have, water supply. And so, countries, I believe, have, kind of responded. We've seen a lot of hand hygiene facilities being kind of temporarily installed, or some actions, but that needs to be sustained over time.
Thank you for that. I've now got a question from Radio Free Asia. Could you, sorry, I'm just lost your name for a minute. Could you unmute? I don't have your name on my list, but could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Hi, my name is Heijun Seo, and I'm from Radio Free Asia. My question is towards the countries that are not included in the report because they're categorized as the countries of no response. Specifically, I want to ask about DPRK. I've seen some reports on the humanitarian work that the DPRK was not able to be accessed due to COVID-19, but there were some significant progress in supporting drinking water and hygiene last year in terms of the WASH program. So could you give a little more details about the countries like North Korea, and what are the alternatives for these countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So the participation of countries to the GLASS survey in this particular cycle that started in 2021 was on a voluntary basis. And governments were invited to participate. So just generally worldwide, some countries decided to participate, some decided, did not provide any information. But that does not mean that there is no data. So we have 121 countries that participated, as was mentioned by Margaret and Bruce. In this cycle, this is the first time we've had so many countries around the world participate, which is extremely exciting because this is the first time we've got the most extensive, comprehensive data set about the enabling environment and WASH systems element available at our fingertips. And I feel that many countries have data available and may or may not participate in GLASS, but we do encourage all countries in the future to participate. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks very much for that question and great answer. Now the next journalist with the hand up is Kerry Cullinan from Health Policy Watch. Kerry, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks. I come from South Africa, which is a water scarce country, and we predicted to be running out of water by 2030 for our residents. Yet we still have waterborne sewage, sanitation, and that, like many other countries in Africa. I know that there have been some attempts to encourage people to adopt other options, but these don't seem to have been encouraged on a mass scale. So I just wondered whether you could respond to alternatives to waterborne sewage. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question, and I think our sort of policy at WHO is to encourage safe management of sanitation through the sanitation chain, whether it's through, as you were saying, waterborne sewage or reticulated systems, to sewage treatment plants, or through on-site sanitation, whether that is sort of safely managed septic tanks, or some type of latrine where there is a safe collection of the excreta and then safe disposal. And that, of course, poses a challenge because we find that one of the things we did look at in this report and is the sort of regulatory functions, even the policy work associated with promoting on-site sanitation, so this alternative, because we do recognize that, especially in dense urban areas, putting in sewage systems is off-site is not necessarily feasible. So it's an important point, and there's clearly a lot of work for countries to do as far as monitoring, policy, regulations, and financing to make sure that we kind of safely manage that sanitation or that excreta that is coming through, essentially being contained in household kind of systems, and that needs to be transported off-site and treated properly, and maybe even reused safely. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Now we have another question that I'll have to read out. It's the journalist does not have his hand up, but it's from Jeff Tansey, who's a freelancer. And his question is, I remember reporting 40 years ago in summer 1982 for World Water magazine from Turkey on their plans for the UN's International Drinking Water and Sanitation Decade. Why do you think you're still having to highlight the urgent need to action on this issue?
Well, first of all, I would like to acknowledge the question and observation, because it's true that we've had international decades before, and so the question is, what is making this round any different? And people may point to innovations in technology. People may point to examples of political will, which we've seen in India, or people might be pessimistic and think why haven't we been able to solve this problem? I can only say this. In certain regions, and we know in Western Europe and North America, when we've put systems in place like simple chlorination of drinking water, we've seen massive drops in typhoid. So it is a matter of unfortunately it's a matter, or fortunately it's a matter of political will. It's a matter of countries feeling at the highest level of their country that this should be a priority. And so it's one interesting story is Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and I think there was another country as well, but they were at a similar economic development as some of the countries in Africa, and each of the leaders of those countries made a commitment to sort of essentially clean up the country, to clean it up hygienically, provide water, and that was before they were rich. And so we're just hoping that other countries will see the economic wisdom of this and the example and the fact that it can be done, and some countries are trying to do that. So we're holding on to that hope, but again, these things take decades of progress, or decades of time.
Thank you very much for that. We've really come to the end of the questions online, but we have a question on the economics. Money is being spent, but is it being spent well? Is it being spent the right way? Each year we hear about the billions needed, but is it going in the right direction?
Well, I think that's a great question. Unfortunately in this report we don't have the visibility and analysis to really sort of deal with whether the investments actually kind of certainly at local level created like good sustainable wash systems. But I think that what we do know what makes good investments. And so, obviously non-corruption, obviously money towards systems, like I mentioned regulation a few times, but strengthening those institutions that have oversight over drinking water services and making sure that there's a viable utility providing drinking water sanitation so that we can mobilize, for example, private sector funding when they know that investors will see cost recovery from this. So that's a virtuous cycle. When things work well, when you deal with water leakages and unaccounted for water, people are willing to pay for water. And so when people themselves are, paying, they tend to expect a service. And so I think that is where we'll see more efficiency. And when people don't get a good service, there tends not to be good cost recovery. So it's sort of this acknowledgement that there needs to be strategic investments by government, but it's households themselves that are ultimately going to be paying for this service, and it has to be a good one.
I'd like to add to that. Thank you very much, Bruce. I'd like to emphasize that many, many years ago when the GLASS initiative started, back in 2008, very few countries were actually able to provide any information on financial data. And I think at that time, back in 2008, 2010, we only had 3 countries that were in a position to provide such data. I think today, and what we have done is developed a deep dive on developing wash accounts, which is actually based on WHO's National Health Accounts methodology, which actually answers some really super easy questions about how much is actually being spent in the sector. Because without that kind of information, how can you advocate for more budget within the central ministry and the Ministry of Finance? Another question it tries to answer is who's paying for services? Is it households? Is it government? Is it others? And another question that it tries to answer is how much is actually going to sanitation? How much is going to drinking water and how much is going to hygiene? And very often, these simple questions, there are no answers for most countries. So with our team, we've started providing capacity and support and developing tools to be able to answer these simple questions. And we now have more than 30 countries worldwide, mainly in Africa, that are developing wash accounts to have a better picture and be able to track financial flows in the water, sanitation and hygiene sector. And much of this information is included in the report and will also be included in the data portal that is being launched tomorrow, which is the glass.who.int, where all information will be available on the wash accounts as well as all the data that's been collected for the GLASS report.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those great answers. And there's one more question. Does this report, does this data collection help you identify things that have worked and things that haven't worked?
Absolutely. And that's the whole aim of the GLASS report, is to really look at the enabling environment and the wash system elements around access. So we're looking at governance, we're looking at monitoring, we're looking at human resources. Do we have enough human resources in place to deliver the services for drinking water, for sanitation? It also looks at finance. Is the money there? How much is being spent? And so it really, the report, and as I think you'll see, there's many nuggets in this report which pinpoints to some of the countries that are doing well. But it also helps to pinpoint where there's gaps and where acceleration is needed and where this acceleration and where action and what type of action can be taken. So we really are counting on being able for countries to take this action moving forward and to be able to use these results that we've compiled, which have come from countries themselves, in a way that's easily accessible to all and to be able to make those decisions and move forward.
Thank you very much for all those questions, for all those answers, I should say. Excellent answers to the questions. We have come to the end of the question and answer section, but I'd just like to ask both of you if you've got some final remarks. Are there some things you'd like to just really emphasize to make sure that we get our messages across?
Yeah, I mean, thanks to all the questions as well for everyone online. But I just, yeah, I mean, I think that, when we think it's just this whole issue of water, sanitation, hygiene being an intractable problem. We heard from one journalist, and kind of like, it's sort of Groundhog Day again. We're sort of pleading for water and sanitation, and people can't understand, for example, why we don't have even water and sanitation and hygiene in healthcare facilities. And I do want to maybe end with that point, because I think it's an opportunity. Even when we look within the health sector, we see that this may be neglected from budgets. We know that 50%, and this is, I have to pause here, 50% of healthcare facilities around the world are lacking hand hygiene at a point of care or at a toilet. And if we don't have that service, then I'm not sure how we could provide healthcare. And I'm sure my colleagues in infection prevention control will agree. So what the opportunity is to essentially ensure that we have that necessary infrastructure in place so that healthcare professionals can do their job, that workers have a dignified place to work, and that patients are protected. It's not rocket science, but it's not happening. So we're hoping with this awareness that someone's going to take action and say enough is enough.
And I'd just like to say data is power. And use this data's got to be used. It's got to be used for resource allocation. It's got to be used for decision making, for priority setting, and for governments to be able to make the right decisions. And I think it's time to make some noise so that we can really improve the access to water and sanitation and hygiene to those that need it most. And as many know, there's many disparities at country level, and we need to make sure that everybody is being reached, even the vulnerable. So I urge you all to really use the information that's contained in this report and to highlight what's going well, but also where acceleration and priority can be, where we can take action, basically. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for your interest.
Thank you, both Bruce Gordon and Fiona Gore, for this really, really important report. Water and sanitation should be front and centre, not an afterthought. And all the audio file will be available on request. We'll also, as I said, we've got the report you can have. If you haven't read it yet, you can request it. We will get it for you. Any questions that you have later on, please send to media inquiries and we will answer. And as I mentioned before, the embargo lifts 0900 tomorrow, Wednesday, the 14th. Thank you all very much for attending. I now close this press conference.
So with this report, we've tracked the efforts of countries to actually progress on water, sanitation, and hygiene. We know the situation's terrible. We know billions of people are without access to even these basic, kind of services. When we look at the targets that the countries themselves have made with their own resources and through their own policies, we find, troubling kind of trajectory to not making those targets. So when we look at sanitation, 25% of countries only are on track to meet their own defined targets of countries. In the same situation with drinking water, 45%. We do find progress. We find when we look at some trend data, we find that government spending has increased. So there, despite COVID and despite it being a financially difficult time around the world, there has been a 5% increase in public expenditure. So that's a good news story. We're also seeing more countries with costed plans. So they're taking more steps to have a kind of accurate and quantitative approach to solving the problem. In our analysis, we've found a number of enabling factors that countries have taken and that kind of are the hallmarks of countries that have done well. And one of these is simply spending, having the systems in place and the human resources in place to spend the funds that are actually committed by a finance ministry, for example. Another is to make sure we get cost recovery of operations and maintenance through tariffs. And have good regulatory functions. So these are simple kind of enabling environment type functions that almost any country could do and should do. And we think this is, something that can be done right away. We know from this report and other reports that it's disproportionately felt in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and within countries there are great disparities. If you're looking at an issue like kind of access to small water supplies, it's both a developed and developing country issue. So there is very much a situation where there's marginalized people feeling the impacts the worst. And that was, of course, highlighted in COVID, whole COVID time, where we saw hand hygiene as a major issue, where this lack of hand hygiene around the world prevented people from taking a basic health protection measure.
If you want to check the antibodies, you have to take the blood sample.
Maybe they might have figured out a way we're not.
Part of it's financing, but part of it is acknowledging that water sanitation hygiene is dependent on systems. So it's dependent on good regulation, it's dependent on good governance and policies, strong institutions. There's no shortcut, there's no silver bullet. And all these things kind of have to happen progressively for there to be a difference to be made. In March of 2023, the world's coming together for the first time in 50 years to discuss how to accelerate progress. And so we don't think there is a more opportune time than now for countries to recommit to these targets and to ensure their infrastructure and plans are climate resilient and to really try to save some lives.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. And I want to stress this, that clean drinking water is a human right that is very achievable for us on this planet Earth. And there's a lot that we can do, work together with other communities around the world to ensure that we do have sufficient amounts of drinking water. There are other conditions that do come into play where water becomes in short supply. We have seen it on the North American Pacific coast, where drought conditions have come that have brought water shortages to areas like California, Oregon, parts of British Columbia. And water conservation becomes more of an issue. But water conservation is very different from making sure that there is a clean drinking water supply. And there are methods and ways that we just heard, and from this report, of how we all can work together to bring that to fruition and ensure that everybody has clean drinking water available to them. So, if you haven't done so, please do click on that subscribe button no matter where you see it, whether you're on Spotify or Google Play, Apple Play, Spreaker, being our top runners in playtime. So click on that subscribe button so you can get continued updates from every time we post a podcast. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. please contact us at depictions.media for more information.